Welcome to Movie Speeching. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take good care. Day Shift is the name of the movie. Please like and subscribe to get every update. The film begins with Bud, a seemingly ordinary pool cleaner, doing his job at homes across Los Angeles. However, when the owner left, he revealed his hunting equipment and broke into a nearby house. He is actually a vampire hunter who hunts vampires for their fangs, as they can be sold for a high price. He meets an old woman and a young man, then defeats them. They turn out to be older vampires. Then he pulled out their fangs and left in his humble truck. Bud returns home and takes care of his wound. It also spreads a yellow sticky substance throughout the body. He then picked up his daughter, Paige, from school, took her to Yogurt World, and then drove her to his ex-wife, Jocelyn's house. Bud soon learns that Jocelyn cannot afford to pay Paige's college tuition and dental bills, so she plans to sell her house and move with Paige to Florida. Devastated that he won't see Paige again, Bud promises to find enough money for Paige so they don't have to move. Jocelyn gives him until next Monday. Meanwhile, Audrey, a real estate agent who is also a vampire, talks to another vampire who disagrees with her ways and is buried alive under a newly built house. Bud goes to a pawn shop owned by his close acquaintance, Troy, to sell vampire fangs. Troy only offered a fairly low price for the canines. If Bud wants to make more money, he suggests that Bud sell it to the Union, an official vampire hunting facility from which Bud was evicted some time ago. However, Bud still makes money from Troy by selling guns and Air Jordan sneakers. Back in the car, he gets a call from Paige. Now Bud is determined to raise money for Paige's tuition and braces so she doesn't have to leave him. He contacted another friend of his, nicknamed Big J, to ask for help. Meanwhile, Audrey discovers the deaths of the vampires previously killed by Bud. She cried, then smelled the house to detect the murderer. She and her assistant deduce that the killer is just a man, and then they are determined to find him. Bud meets Big J and together they enter the Union, meeting the leader of the organization named Ralph Seeger. They express Bud's intention to join the Union, and Big J assures that Bud has changed since he was kicked out of the Union due to his mistakes. However, Ralph is unsure about Bud, as he has broken many rules, including endangering the life of another organization member during a hunt due to his rather aggressive hunting style. His con. After difficult negotiations, Ralph agrees to give Bud a 1-week trial. He would be assigned to the day shift even though he asked to be transferred to the night shift when he could make more money. Ralph also arranged for a union representative who was to accompany Bud at all times during the hunt to ensure that he did not violate any rules. After meeting Ralph, Bud goes to the union's accounting department to sell his canines. He is served by Seth, a regular employee who turns out to be the union representative whom Ralph has assigned to accompany Bud during his probation. Although Seth hesitates because he believes he is not suitable for field duties, Ralph promises to promote him if he can complete the job. Seth arrives at Bud's apartment early in the morning and finds him preparing to go hunting. Bud doesn't act friendly towards him even though Seth offers breakfast and tries to be friendly. On the way, Bud questions Seth about his knowledge of vampires. Although he has never hunted a vampire before, Seth has exceptional knowledge of vampires and the rules of the League. He knows there are 5 types of vampires. The people Bud is going to hunt today are preteens, people who were still young when they were turned into vampires. Even though their fangs aren't worth much compared to other vampire species, Bud decides to continue hunting them to raise money for Paige. Meanwhile, Audrey goes to Troy's pawn shop and finds one of the old vampire's fangs. He asked Troy who gave him the fawn, but Troy refused to answer. Audrey tells him that vampires were once worshipped as gods by humans. She intends to restore her to her former glory by using her day job as a real estate agent to reclaim properties throughout the valley area of Los Angeles for the vampires to call home. She brutally kills Troy after he continues to refuse to cooperate with her. Returning to Bud's hunt, he and Seth arrive at an abandoned bowling alley, an ideal hideout for young vampires. Bud ordered Seth to stay in the car even though Seeger kept asking him to follow him. Seeger then calls Seth, urging him to follow Bud so he can check to see if Bud has broken any league rules. When he enters the bowling alley, he quickly becomes nervous because he has never experienced the horror of hunting vampires before, but Bud skillfully defeats all the vampires. Seth, frightened by the experience, vomited and wet his own pants. Bud calms him down, drives him home, and gives him the yellow substance he also uses. This is a special mixture intended to mask their body odor so that it is difficult for vampires to track them. After returning to his truck, Bud realized that Seth had forgotten his notebook and read it. He then texted Jocelyn to tell her he had raised half the money needed and told her to be patient. On his way home, he runs into a new tenant next door, Heather, who appears to be a nurse. The next day, Bud picks Seth up from home and reads his notebook aloud. Seth recorded all of Bud's violations yesterday but did not report them to Ralph. Bud begs Seth to give him a few days, enough to raise money for Paige, and then he can be kicked out of the league again. He goes to Troy's pawn shop to buy equipment but instead finds Troy's decapitated body. They also discover Bud's name written on the table, which may have been revealed by Troy after being tortured by Audrey. Seth immediately wants to report the civilian deaths to Ralph, but Bud forbids him. He later admitted that the real reason he was determined to join the union despite his tendency to break rules was to raise money for his daughter before losing her. Seth takes pity on him and agrees not to report Bud's transgression to Ralph until Monday. Upon returning home, Bud sees Heather arguing with a man from his apartment window. The next day, Bud and Seth meet the Nazarian brothers, famous vampire hunters disguised as stereo repairmen. They agree to work together to attack a vampire nest and divide the portion. Seth pees on himself again and is nearly bitten while the others deftly defeat the vampires. After all the vampires are defeated, Seth observes that the hive is made up of many different species of vampires living together, which is unusual. The Nazarian brothers also explain that vampires have now invented a sunscreen that allows them to bask in the sun for a few minutes so they can go out during the day. On the way home, Bud compliments Seth's progress and tells him that he has the potential to become a hunter. After the hunt, Bud takes Paige to his friend's birthday party. While waiting for the children, he received a call from Audrey threatening him. He immediately knew he and his family were in danger, so he quickly took Paige back home. He notices Audrey's men chasing him, so he tells Paige to put on her headphones and play a game on her iPad while he outruns his pursuers. Bud identifies one of the pursuers as the man he saw arguing with Heather last night. Unfortunately, Audrey went to Jocelyn's house and took her hostage. Bud also sees Seth unconscious, lying in the living room after being bitten by a vampire. Audrey leaves Bud, taking Jocelyn and Paige with her. She was sure that once Seth woke up, he would eat Bud. However, even with his newfound bloodlust and vampiric abilities, Seth was no match for Bud, who promptly decapitated him. Surprisingly, he is still alive and is trying to reattach his head to his body. The two leave the house and go to Heather's apartment when Bud realizes that she may be working with Audrey. Bud and Seth later learned that Heather had been turned into a vampire by Audrey, so she was forced to do everything for Audrey, albeit reluctantly. Audrey hunts down Bud because the old woman Bud killed earlier was her daughter, and she is looking for revenge. As they talk, Audrey takes Jocelyn and Paige to the sacred vampire land, where she plans to turn Paige into a vampire and have her bite Jocelyn. Meanwhile, Seth tries to adapt to his new life as a vampire and uses his new abilities under the guidance of Heather. Seth and Heather agree to help Bud take down Audrey, then they head to her underground base. Seth secretly informed Big J, who suddenly appeared to help when the three were overwhelmed by too many vampires. At one point in the fight, Big J was bitten but he refused to give up. He leaves Bud to confront Audrey alone while he sacrifices himself by detonating a bomb to eliminate the emerging vampires. Seth and Heather meet Audrey's bodyguard while Bud searches for Audrey. After a difficult 2-on-1 battle, the bodyguard finally gained the upper hand by strangling Seth and Heather with each of his hands, but they managed to free themselves by pulling the bodyguard's limbs along different directions until they separated. On the other hand, even though Audrey possesses super strength and super speed, Bud still tries to outwit her by secretly placing a thin silver wire in front of him. This was actually a very effective method because as she approached him at high speed, she accidentally went through the rope and it slashed her neck, killing the vampire instantly. After all the vampires are defeated, Bud kisses Jocelyn and Paige, then they meet Heather and Seth, whom Bud introduces as good vampires. Ralph and his union group arrive on the scene and berate Bud and Seth for not reporting anything. He begins accusing them of breaking many rules, but Seth defends himself by exploiting loopholes in the rules. Even if he doesn't get promoted to secretary, Seth decides he'll be a better hunter working alongside Bud. As Bud and his family leave, Big J, who survived the explosion because he is now a vampire, appears from the manhole. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video.